Hey there, this is Jake from the Chasing Quality podcast. Thanks for joining me. Today I'm going to talk to you about Premiere Pro performance upgrades for your PC. I have had my PC, I've had it up and running. I built it maybe a year and a half ago, and I've done some minor tweaks along the way, a little bit of RAM, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. A week ago, I decided to really do this a little bit more deliberately, approach it from multiple angles, and to test along the way to see what would provide me with the greatest performance boost to Premiere Pro. That will help to inform me as I go forward with future upgrades. So let's talk about what I had before I started the upgrade. Before I started the upgrade, I was using a Gigabyte Z390 Designare motherboard, along with an Intel i5 9600K processor. The GPU was an NVIDIA GTX 970. I believe it's an MSI branded one. I had 1.5 terabytes of storage space, and that comprised two 256 gigabyte NVMe drives, one for the OS, one for my production files, a 500 gigabyte kind of a media storage drive for archives and photos, and then a 250 gigabyte SSD for random other files and cache. I also had 32 gigabytes of RAM, and that was in a 4 by 8 gigabyte configuration. So I decided to approach those main specs that we all often look to: RAM, processor, hard drive space, and video card. Upgrading the motherboard can help, but really the upgrading the motherboard is just really providing you flexibility for those other things you put in there. So the motherboard's a pretty good motherboard, and it will give me a few years of use, so I'm not worried about the motherboard. So let's first talk about the RAM. Specific to Premiere Pro with RAM, you're going to notice the greatest difference, I think, in your timeline performance, in loading of files and moving things around. I have not experienced much of a difference when it comes to the rendering phase of Premiere Pro. Now, if you have very limited RAM, and I would say by very limited, anything under 16 gigabytes, that could very well be your bottleneck. You want at least 16 gigabytes of RAM for Premiere Pro. It's a RAM hog, and Adobe After Effects is even more of a RAM hog. So if you're doing a lot of video work, you're going to want at least 16 gigabytes, and I would say 32 gigabytes is probably the sweet spot for most people. I had 32 gigabytes, and I wanted to try 64 gigabytes. I actually wanted to go to 128, but currently there's a scarcity of RAM, and RAM is very expensive. So I ended up settling on 64 gigabytes, but that was still expensive. The cost difference between 32 gigabytes and 64 gigabytes was nearly $150. I went with a 2 by 32 gigabyte configuration because I want to be able to upgrade with another 64 gigabytes easily when that time comes, when RAM gets cheaper, maybe a year from now. But at this moment in time, it's pretty expensive getting those larger capacity cards. So that was 150 gigabytes. Now, I installed it, got everything switched around. I don't think there was any improvement whatsoever in rendering performance. That wasn't surprising to me. I did, however, notice a slight improvement in the timeline experience. Is maybe a little bit smoother. I couldn't quite go from a quarter quality in the playback to half quality, but it was noticeable. There were fewer drop frames and things like that. And I did see a noticeable increase when I ran Nova Bench. There was a slight bump in the performance score. Not much, but it did help a little bit with the frames per second and a few other areas. The cost was not worth it for the returns that I saw as far as rendering. In the other areas, perhaps, but not for the rendering itself. So that's enough with RAM. So I would recommend with RAM, get 32 gigabytes. You can get 4 by 8 gigabyte chips for maybe about $100 or so, and that will get you pretty far. All right, next let's talk about the processor. I went from the i5 9600K to the i7 9700KF. The K version has integrated graphics. The KF does not. This makes the KF slightly cheaper. I was nervous about going to the KF because I thought that would maybe have an impact. And if I did not have an external GPU, it would have had an impact. And I had to change a couple settings to make sure that it was properly working. But that upgrade was about $100. It's about $150 for the 9600K and about $260 or so for the 9700KF. I noticed a significant boost in the timeline experience. I was able to go from a quarter quality in the preview to almost half quality in the preview without a noticeable degradation in performance. And it's just been an overall smoother experience in Adobe Premiere Pro. Now, the biggest difference between the 9700K and the 9600K is really the added cores. There isn't a huge difference in actual clock speed, but there was a big difference in the cores. Now, you need a program that's going to utilize those cores properly to take advantage of it. It did seem like Premiere Pro took advantage of those added cores, so I was pretty happy with that. I did want to go to the 9900K, the i9 9900K, but that would have been another $100, $150, and I couldn't justify it at this point in time. I do think, however, based on the benchmarks I've seen, that it would likely show a similar increase of about 30 to 40% over the 9700K that I have now. So it may have actually doubled the speed of what I previously had. But keep in mind that as you're doing these upgrades, you can upgrade your processor, but then your GPU becomes a bottleneck, and you can't take full advantage of it. So you really need to upgrade multiple parts of it to make sure you don't have one bottleneck. And that's what I was trying to do. So what I plan to do is maybe a year from now, when the 9900K comes down in price a little bit, I'll maybe grab that and swap it out and notice a nice performance boost. Okay, so onto the GPU. The GPU is a very difficult area right now because as I record this, there is a major scarcity of graphics cards on the market. NVIDIA, in my opinion, offers up the best performance out there. Their GTX and RTX lines of graphics cards are phenomenal. However, they're completely sold out. You cannot buy them brand new right now. So you have to buy them on the used market. And on the used market, the newer cards, the RTXs, are going for twice the MSRP. And that's affecting all cards, all the older cards too. The GTX 970 that I bought a year ago for $120 is now going for $125, $130. So I've actually earned money on it. I've earned interest better than the stock market buying that card. But what I was able to find is I was able to find a GTX 980 Ti, which is a few years old, but significantly better than the 970. And I was able to find it for $175, which to some people maybe sounds like a lot because it's such an old card, but on the used market is a good price. And it was only about $50 more than the 970 that I had. Only being $50 more, I was able to get roughly 30 to 40% performance boost for my rendering. And it didn't really impact the playback very much, but it did improve the rendering significantly. It improved the speed of applying applying effects such as warp stabilizer that uses the GPU. Those are a lot faster now. There are other areas too that it's not even just the raw speed of the processor for the 980. It's also the fact that it can go up to 85 degrees centigrade before throttling, whereas the 970 would throttle at 65 degrees centigrade. It's also got a different cooler design where the fan is more like a blower, so it takes air in, blows it through like a wind tunnel, and out the back as exhaust, whereas the 970 just had two fans or circulating air around itself. So I noticed a huge difference going to the 980 Ti for only $50. I think that's probably the winner, honestly, as far as bang for your buck. Maybe a year down the road when the 1080 Ti's are cheaper, I'll get one of those. But 980 Ti is going for 175. The 1080 is going for about 425. You'd be better off getting two 980 Ti's than you would getting one 1080 Ti if you have the space and the power to power both of those. All right, so that's enough about the GPUs. Let's talk about the storage space. So I did upgrade the overall storage capacity. I didn't really do too much shifting, though. I already had NVMe drives, and probably the biggest change was that I went from an SSD for my cache to an NVMe. I haven't noticed a big improvement with that, but NVMe drives are so cheap now that they're only maybe 5 to 10% more expensive than the SSDs. If you're going to upgrade your storage, get an NVMe drive. There, I don't think is a really good reason anymore to get an SSD unless you need something that's super huge capacity, or you want something that's a little more plug and play. You can pull it out really easily, or you just don't have the space for NVMe drives. If you don't have enough slots, maybe your motherboard doesn't have a slot, or maybe you've got those two slots filled. So I didn't notice a performance increase really within Premiere Pro, although it does seem like the files load a little bit faster. Rendering was negligible. The real difference where I see the NVMe drives outperforming everything else is in file transfer. Okay, so let's go ahead and look at some tests for the storage. Here we have three different storage drives: the Samsung 970 EVO NVMe, a Western Digital Blue SATA SSD, and a Kingston A400 SATA SSD. The Samsung 970 EVO for 500 gigabytes right now is running for approximately $97.95. That's about 19 cents per gigabyte. The Western Digital Blue 3D NAND SATA SSD for 500 gigabytes is running for about $53.99 on Amazon, and that comes in at about 11 cents per gigabyte. And finally, the Kingston A400 SATA SSD for 480 gigabytes, that is about $46.99 on Amazon, which equates to about 9.8 cents per gigabyte. So, in the end, the Kingston is definitely the cheapest. But what you're going to see is with the results, the Kingston is the one that you do not want. I would absolutely avoid it at all costs because there are far, far better options for just a couple bucks more. Okay, so let's look at some performance tests. For all three tests, we are transferring 48 gigabytes from the same source NVMe drive to each of these three test drives. First up is the Kingston A400 SATA SSD. Okay, so at first, the file transfer appears to be going pretty quickly. And then if we look at Task Manager, we're going to see that it drops very, very quickly when it comes to writing to that drive. And the reason why we get that very quick boost in the beginning is because the OS is actually transferring those files first through memory and then through the buffer at the destination drive. As soon as that buffer fills up and the writing slows down, those files are just sitting there in memory, hanging out with no place to go. So we see the write speeds drop very quickly down to an average of about 60, maybe 50, 55 to 70 on average, somewhere around in there, megabytes per second. And that's pretty darn slow. I get better transfers from my SD cards when I'm bringing in files into my computer. And so I consider this a pretty pitiful performance. And it just goes on and on and on for 12 and a half minutes. And then we see it very, very slowly making its way out of RAM at the end and finally onto that drive. So pretty pitiful performance. It took me longer to transfer these files from one drive to another than it did for Premiere Pro to process equivalently the same amount of information to build a movie and rendering. That's pretty sad. Okay, so next up we're looking at the Western Digital Blue 3D NAND drive, and same transfer. All right, so here we see it go a little bit further with full speed, and then it drops down quickly. And again, that's really getting this stuff transferred over memory. If you look carefully at the memory, you're going to see the memory take on about an extra 4 to 8 gigabytes. But once this thing levels out, this transfer is averaging about 216, 220 megabytes per second, somewhere around in there. And it's able to hold that throughout the whole transfer, all the way to the end. And this one ends up finishing at about 3 minutes and 20 seconds or so. So that's a lot. That's a lot better. And then, of course, it finishes the write there at the end. And so really the biggest difference between this one and the previous one, the Western Digital and the Kingston, is that the Western Digital's write speeds are significantly faster. It's not so much the transfer speeds, it's the write speeds. And so if those write speeds are too slow and the buffer fills up, then the operating system can't continue sending those files over to the drive. It has to keep them in RAM waiting. So here you're getting roughly 4 times the write speed with the Western Digital as you were with the Kingston for only about 1 penny more per gigabyte. I would say that is a pretty clear winner there. All right, so let's then move on to the last one. And this is our Samsung 970 EVO NVMe drive. And here we go. And you'll see that it started off at a little over 2 gigabytes per second. It's kind of holding it just below 2 gigabytes per second. And now it drops. It pushed over about 20 gigabytes before it dropped. So if you're transferring roughly 20 gigabytes or so, you're going to get that full speed. And now it's at its bottom. Now it's bottoming out at 400 and let's just call it 410 megabytes per second. So it's roughly double what we had with the Western Digital. And gosh, how much that's, I'm trying to do the math in my head here. That's about 7 times faster than the Kingston. And if you go back to the beginning portion of it, the first 20 gigabytes, it was roughly 40 to 50 times the Kingston. So this one just completely annihilates the Kingston and crushes pretty good the Western Digital. Now, you're not always going to need this kind of speed. Small files, random access is not a big deal. But when you're doing the sequential read and write, these NVMe drives are simply the way to go. And we finished in 1 minute and 22 seconds. Wow, pretty amazing. And here are our final results. The Kingston A400 at 63.7 megabytes per second, the Western Digital Blue at 225.3 megabytes per second, and the Samsung 970 EVO at 585.48 megabytes per second. I think we have a clear winner. Okay, and now for the surprise upgrade that was free. The surprise upgrade was leaving my computer case open. My previous configuration for my computer was super silent, very silent. Part of that was because I had quieter fans that ran at lower speeds. That also meant that the airflow was a little more restricted. At the time, I wanted a very quiet environment in my recording room, but now that I'm running Premiere Pro more often, I do want a performance increase. And so what happened was, and I just noticed this by chance, as I was doing some changes, I left my computer case open, and that improved the performance of rendering by about 50%. Now, this is my old configuration, but by about 50%. And it's not that the heat itself causes a performance hit. It's that as your computer gets hotter, your CPU may start to throttle its speed, or your graphics card may start to throttle its speed in order to keep it from overheating. And that's exactly what was happening, is my GPU, my 970, was throttling itself because of the heat. And that made like about a 50% difference. It was huge. It was amazing how big of a difference it made. So what I did to mitigate this was I purchased one more fan that was $20 for intake. And when I moved to the 980 Ti, which has a blower configuration where it sucks the air in and then blows it out the back, those two things in concert made a huge difference because that created more airflow. And additionally, the 980 Ti can go up about 20 degrees more before throttling than the 970. With that change, adding that fan and changing the type of GPU cooler, I was able to see a similar performance with the case closed or the case open. So one thing that you may want to do before upgrading is you may want to bring up Task Manager and look at your system performance and see what the heat profile looks like. Look and see what is being throttled. Where is that bottleneck? Is the bottleneck in your GPU? Is the bottleneck in your CPU? If you've got a motherboard that checks temperature, you may want to look at the temperature there because it could be, you could have a cooling issue. Again, it's not the heat itself, it's the computer's reaction to the heat, throttling it to protect it from getting too hot that is going to have that impact. Okay, so in the end, I was able to nearly double my performance, my rendering speeds specifically. And I was able to significantly improve the timeline performance and the enjoyment that I have, that experience in working with the timeline, mostly by upgrading my GPU, and I didn't have to go very far, and upgrading my CPU. And there, I didn't have to go very far on that one either. Those two upgrades, they were about $200 combined. Along with the, let's throw in the added fan. The added intake fan was another $20. So $220, and I was able to double my rendering speed. And I was able to significantly improve the experience in the timeline and working with my files in Adobe Premiere. I would consider that a pretty big win for me. If you're doing this as a business, you definitely want the fastest processing you can afford. If you're doing it as a hobby, you may want to max it out as well. I mean, time is precious, sometimes more precious than money. So that's where I would spend my money if I had to do it again. Next time I go to upgrade, I'm not upgrading my RAM. I may upgrade my processor and I may upgrade my GPU again, but those two things should be the only things I need to upgrade. So I hope that you found this useful. And I know that I've been searching for answers on how to upgrade my computer for the best Premiere Pro performance. If you haven't checked out the podcast, please do. Chasing Quality Podcast. You can find us on Stitcher, Spotify, iTunes, or you can go straight to the website at chasingquality.transistor.fm. Until next time, keep chasing that quality, because you know we will. Bye-bye.